If there is one hallmark of the Trump era, one strategy that has been employed to force through a radical agenda, it might be this one, first articulated by Steve Bannon all the way back in 2018. The Democrats don't matter, Bannon said. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with stuff. He didn't say stuff, but you get the idea. Now, Steve Bannon was overstating the role of the media and understating the role of actual Democratic officials, but that flood the zone approach, that is something we have seen Trump do to great effect over the years. It's not that Trump is some kind of brilliant tactician, but on some level, Trump does seem to realize that the best way to avoid scrutiny is to simply do a whole lot of bad things all at once to keep everyone's attention divided. Something that we are seeing play out right now, today, this hour. Today, Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace introduced a bill that would ban transgender people on Capitol Hill from using the bathroom of the gender they identify with. It's clear that this bill was designed to stoke controversy about Congresswoman-elect Sarah McBride, who became the first openly transgender person ever elected to Congress in this past election. Under Mace's bill, Congresswoman-elect McBride would be forced to use the men's room on Capitol Hill. It's an obviously dehumanizing attempt to bully a new member of Congress. It's a clear attempt to gain the spotlight, given the fact that Representative Mace just 3 years ago co-sponsored a bill that would have protected transgender people from exactly this kind of discrimination. And here is what she says now.
Is this effort in response to Congresswoman McBride's coming to Congress?
Yes, and absolutely. And if McBride wants to go to the gym, she can go to Planet Fitness, where they allow biological men to be around in a room in a private space with underage girls. Like, no, thank you. It's not going to happen, not on my watch.
The irony here is that if there are any alleged or accused sexual predators coming to town in January 2025, they may be two of Trump's own cabinet picks. Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth are both currently fighting allegations of sexual misconduct, allegations that both men deny. But Nancy Mace is worried about transgender people using her bathroom. This is literally what it means to flood the zones. We are now talking about Nancy Mace and transgender panic and not, say, the unfitness of Trump's cabinet picks and the very real threats they pose to the agencies they are set to lead. For example, today, The Bulwark unearthed video from 2020 of RFK Jr., Trump's pick to lead the Health and Human Services Agency, suggesting that he is open to the idea that the global coronavirus pandemic was actually a sinister government conspiracy.
Many people argue that this pandemic was a plandemic, that it was planned from the outset, that it's part of a sinister scheme. I can't tell you the answer to that. I don't have enough evidence.
Just to be clear, the pandemic that caused the deaths of more than 1 million people in the United States, the COVID pandemic, was not planned by the U.S. government. Here's another example. A few hours ago, Trump named Dr. Mehmet Oz, the failed Pennsylvania Senate candidate and former TV doctor, to run the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Prior to joining Trump's orbit, Dr. Oz already had a reputation as a snake oil salesman. It's something then-Senator Claire McCaskill pressed him on during a 2014 Senate hearing.
Why would you say that something is a miracle in a bottle?
My job, I feel, on the show is to be a cheerleader for the audience.
Years later, Dr. Oz went on to use his platform as a medical influencer to advocate the reopening of schools at the height of the COVID pandemic, even if that meant that potentially hundreds more people, including children, had to die.
Well, first, we need our mojo back. Let's start with things that are really critical to the nation, where we think we might be able to open without getting into a lot of trouble. Yeah, I tell you, schools are a very appetizing opportunity. I just saw a nice piece in The Lancet arguing that the opening of schools may only cost us 2 to 3% in terms of total mortality.
Well, what's the harm in killing 2 to 3% more people if it means getting our mojo back? And here's another example, again from today. ABC News is now reporting, according to multiple sources, that Trump is considering nominating Russell Vought, the architect of Project 2025, for a cabinet-level position. NBC News has not independently verified that reporting, but remember that Donald Trump spent the last 6 months insisting that he had nothing to do with Project 2025. So yes, flooding the zone is the playbook here, and now it is being run in a way that we have literally never seen before. So if this is the new normal, if this is just the way it's going to be now, how do Democrats, how does the media, how should the public stay focused on what is really happening? Joining me now are Dan Pfeiffer, co-host of Pod Save America and former White House senior advisor to President Obama, and Claire McCaskill, former senator from Missouri and current MSNBC political analyst. Dan and Claire, thank you both for being here tonight. Claire, let me just start with you in terms of how it is drinking from a fire hose, quite literally, something we, became adept at in 2016. But this feels like it's a different order of magnitude. And I wonder how you are picking and choosing where to focus both your concern and rage.
Well, that's hard. I feel like I'm halfway between, in a fetal position, depressed and enraged, like every 10 minutes. It's a hell of a roller coaster ride right now. But let me just say this. On these nominees, every senator will have to cast a vote. First, many of them will have to cast votes in committee. And there will be a hearing. And the Democratic senators will have a lot of things to talk about in those hearings. And hopefully they get covered widely by all stripes of media, not just on our network, but on Fox News and on some of the other really right-wing disinformation centers. And hopefully Americans see why these people are completely unqualified. And all these senators, Alex, remember, a bunch of these senators know that this was not a landslide. The Republican senator didn't win in Wisconsin. The Republican Senate candidate didn't win in Nevada. The Republican Senate candidate didn't win in Arizona. The Republican Senate candidate, even though he had a lot of money and was a popular former Republican governor, didn't win in Maryland. There were a lot of states where the Republicans in the Senate were reminded that this is not a country that is lopsided in favor of unqualified nominees for important, complex government jobs. And I think that Trump may be surprised because you only have to have 4 on any of these folks. You only have to have 4. And if you just take the people who aren't running again, you get to 4.
Dan, to that end, I wonder if you think, I understand the desire to sort of sift through the wreckage and say, to debate whether Trump has a mandate or not. But I also think it's clear that certain lines of criticism or coverage have not resonated the way that I think perhaps a lot of people who are tethered to Earth One and the truth would have liked them to. And I wonder if you think that particularly Democrats in the Senate who are going to be part of this confirmation process should adopt a different strategy when thinking about what to focus on with these potential cabinet picks.
I don't know if it's a different strategy. We have a very robust case to make against all of them. I think the thing we have to be careful about as Democrats, and something we've all fell into in 2017 when Trump was elected, is we become the defenders of the status quo, the defenders of the institution. And I think what we can do here is we can acknowledge that institutions, government need to be reformed, but they should not be changed in the way that Donald Trump is proposing, right? And I think we need we can make the case against RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz and all that, and those are very strong cases to make, trust me. But there's a broader case here about what Trump is doing. It is pure cronyism and corruption. He is putting in place people who are going to serve his interest, not the nation's interest. And I think that is an argument that could resonate. Because we got a whole bunch of people who voted for Trump who don't like him and don't agree with him. And they voted for 2 reasons: that he was going to focus on lowering their costs and he was going to bring change to government. But this isn't the change they voted for. So that's the case we should make.
Claire, what do you think about that argument? Just as far as it concerns people like Thom Tillis, people who are up for re-election, people who may be the pivot points here. Do you think that argument works? That this is about a sort of a one-man selfish, self-serving agenda? Is it about our national interest? Is it about sexual assault allegations? What do you think is most resonant in terms of your former Republican colleagues in the Senate?
Well, I think Dan's right in terms of messaging. The Democrats need to be disciplined about presenting these candidates not just as potentially guilty of sexual assault, and not as, that they are really wholly unqualified, but they are part of a Trump agenda to do things that Americans don't want. And so pinning down some of these folks about, well, where would 2/3 of the workforce that you're going to be in charge of, where would you cut those 2/3? Because that's what Musk has said they're going to do. They're going to cut 2/3 of the employees. Well, I would like Dr. Oz, who, with a straight face told me that it was okay for him to say that acai berries were a miracle in a bottle and would cut your fat and all that silliness that he did on his show. I'd like him to explain to the American people how you cut 2/3 of the people that process Medicare payments, or how you cut 2/3 of the people that administer health care in this country in terms of getting payments out that help Americans. I think focusing on the impact it will have on the American people is going to be much more effective. But remember why these guys were chosen, not just to further Trump's ego and his idea that this is all about him, but the other reason they were chosen is they're good performative politicians. They're going to do performance. They're going to do sound bites. They're going to be telegenic. These are not people that are qualified to run anything. I mean, most of these folks have never run anything in their lives, much less a really sprawling, complex organization that has to deliver essential services to the American people who pay for them.